I will continue with the theme I've been on, a eulogy to my profession. This is part 3. I may get done today, but I'm not sure whether I will or not. There's a lot to cry over, so I review my eulogy for my profession. Uh, Today, I will come at the problem from a different perspective. Today, I want to focus on the structural imperfections in how the profession is now situated, almost as if these were flaws in the construction of a building that's gotten taller and is bearing more weight. And the thing is going to collapse because of the imperfections that are built into it right now. So let me back up again. I'll go back to the time that the profession was starting. And I was a young neophyte who was joining a profession that hadn't been around for only a few years when I went to graduate school. Well, huge changes started. The kinds of things that I wanted to study became very popular. The undergraduate major in the universities after World War II, the most popular major was psychology, and people who had become psychology majors had become interested in what kind of careers they might pursue as psychologists. So the pressure to enter graduate school and join one of those two tracks, counseling psychology or clinical psychology, began to increase, and it increased exponentially. I believe when I joined the American Psychological Association in 1953, the first year I started graduate school, I joined as a student member. And then when I finally decided that I wanted to retire from the American Psychological Association, not to leave its membership, but to stop putting so much time and energy into the building of the profession, the membership of the association had gone from 12,000 people in 1953 to over 120,000 people at the time I withdrew from it. And the growth was almost exponential. The curve rose almost straight up for a long time. Those of us who were in governance in the association or were trying to assume leadership positions were joking with each other frequently that by the year 2025, 100% of the membership of the country, 100% of the citizenry would be members of the American Psychological Association if this growth curve continued. What were we confronting though? One of the things that began is we were being trained because there were potentially jobs in the VA for us, but that was shutting down. Even as I said, my favorite professor had been working for the VA when he was doing vocational counseling with me, and it transferred over to become a university professor. So the government had decided to create two professions, but the market for who was going to employ them was left quite vacant and confused. And the existing market that led to their creation was vanishing. So let me make an observation now. All professions exist within a set of cultural beliefs and within a set of economic imperatives of one sort or another. And what happens to as a result of the ongoing and continuing evolution of the culture, and what happens to changes in the economy and how things are paid for and what's important and how things are to be financed, those things are very powerful. The American Psychological Association and me in a leadership position at times did not like many of the things that were happening. But those forces are so powerful. That's like King Canute calling back at the North Sea to stop crashing on the shore. We had no power to alter what was going on. And you'll hear when I get towards the end of my presentation, I think that the current strands of culture and economic pressures that are now alive and affect and deform what we're doing are going to prove devastating and are going to cause the building we're in to collapse. But let me talk about the journey in between. Soon after I entered graduate school, the enrollments in programs in counseling psychology started to fall off. Uh, Clinical psychology had been the jazzy one, the most interesting one, one that was capturing the best minds. The idea that started in World War II that we were to be trained to be the handmaidens of psychiatry was very powerful. That was an observable possible career, and many people thought they could be hired in clinics and hospitals and outpatient centers after graduation, even if the VA positions were not open anymore or were closing. So the obvious movement into hospitals and other settings controlled by physicians and psychiatrists was very, very apparent. Soon after the founding of the profession, though, another movement was starting. Uh, a band of interested and interesting psychologists decided that they didn't want to go work in medical settings. They didn't want to go work for anybody else. They wanted to set up psychological centers. They wanted to take their knowledge and provide services to the public without being supervised by people in a medical setting or without anybody else telling them what to do. They thought they could create how they were to exist and what kinds of services they could be provided that they could provide that would be of interest to the public. So a gradual exodus from academia and from the Veterans Administration out into the public and into public practice began. And it turned, like many other things, into being a flood tide. That became the favorite way that psychologists were going to get an education and come out into the public. Independent practice seemed to be the marching orders of the early days we lived through. And they were very heady days. If you come to a fork in the road, take it. So I just got to a fork in the road. I must mention what the cultural landscape was like back then. There was no internet. If you wanted to find a psychologist, you had a tool available to you. It was the phone book. And the phone book had white pages. Those were all the residences the people lived in and the residential phone number. And then the phone book had yellow pages. The yellow pages were lists of businesses, professional people, all kinds of people who were selling something to the public, some kind of services, some kind of goods. They were in the yellow pages, and they had headings over them like moving companies, accountants. Psychology did not have its own listing in the yellow pages that were in existence while we were training to become psychologists. We were lumped together with fortune tellers and spiritualists. The heading in the yellow pages was psychologists, fortune tellers, and spiritual healers. And that began to feel terrible to us. I remember being hired. I was hired out of graduate school to join a new group practice. The guys who hired me, there were four of them, and they had all been in World War II service, had gotten their degrees, and they decided they wanted to open a center, and they wanted to provide the services they've been learning about to the public for a fee, and they had the courage to start and do it. And people were breaking down the door. There was a really pent-up demand to consult with people called psychologists back then. I'm not sure what drove it, but it was there. And so within a few years of their opening their center, they were adding staff. They hired a social worker from who was just getting a degree from USC, who had been trained to work with children, to come and do work with children. And they added me to the general staff to work with adults and couples. And it was heady times, but we were lamenting how little we were known by the public, how unregulated we were. And we decided that in order to begin to stick in an effective way and take up a reasonable and respected place in the culture, like so many other groups, even barbers, we needed state licensure. That was the way to secure legitimacy. So we started trying to meet legislatures in the various states. All the state psychological associations were proceeding on their own independently and sometimes in collaboration with each other to try and move legislation in the state houses that would declare psychology an independent profession and would set up its own regulations and its own regulating entity. And we were being fought tooth and nail. The general medical profession in general and the psychiatric profession in particular were just taking out inflammatory ads in the newspapers and on the radio and television that was coming, saying that these bills in the legislature were dangerous, that we had inadequate training, we had had no medical training, and we would be harmful to the public if we were licensed. And they kept approaching, while trying to kill us in public, they kept approaching us through the back door. They would be willing to let us be licensed, but we would have to accept the kinds of relationships that they had with nurses. We would be licensed as a profession, but we would be an ancillary profession. Our duties would be as assigned by doctors and under the supervision of doctors. And we who were trying to make the movement happen kept resisting that steadfastly. It was very painful. What's been painful to me was to watch how we've done the very same thing. As we've achieved legitimacy, fast forward 2 or 3 decades, the profession of marriage and family counseling started to blossom in the state of California. And they too started to ask for their own legitimacy. They wanted to become a licensed profession under regulation by the state. And we pulled the same crap. We started saying they didn't have adequate training, that it was only a master's profession. It wasn't a doctoral profession like ours was, and they would harm people, and they didn't have sufficient training in psychopathology and in working with seriously mentally ill people. Their curriculum was tilted towards ordinary folk, and it would be dangerous to let them loose because the text of the laws they were proposing would give them general access to whatever has been called the mental health sphere. And we did the same damn thing. We were joined by the psychiatrists in trying to assassinate the baby marriage, family, and child counseling before it got born properly. I was ashamed, and I would call out to my colleagues and say, this is not good. If we're to be esteemed and cherished, it should be because we have something special, not because we've managed to get a monopoly on the market. That's going to lead to our stagnation. Let us see what we could do to become more beautiful than we are instead of trying to kill other people. That got nowhere. Nobody was listening to me. That's one of many times nobody was listening to me. Well, we succeeded. Starting in about 1962, the first licensing laws were passed in a few states, and it began to spread from state to state. And eventually, psychologists became licensed in all the states of the United States. That was not sufficient. We had now started the professional school movement. So we were training even more psychologists than we had before, because the universities had always trained just a few, hoping that they would teach and do research. But we were starting to train our own progeny. The professional psychologists around the country founded professional schools with a professional faculty, and they were training people not to do research and training, although we had no objection to anybody who wanted to do research and training, but we were training people to take up in service positions in independent practice, in hospitals, in clinics, and outpatient centers, and in the state mental health system. There should be licensed psychologists functioning. And there was a huge demand. That exponential increase in the membership in the American Psychological Association was not created by growing more and more research academics, psychologists. It was grown by the huge flood tide of people who wanted careers in service, who were getting training and joining the profession. We then made what I consider was one of the fatal mistakes. This is a defect, a hole in our foundation that is part of what's going to collapse the whole structure. For whatever reasons, maybe it was stethoscope heavy. I don't know what it was. I think it always annoyed us that psychiatrists in general were being paid more money than psychologists were for doing similar work, often in places. And it pissed us off that many people had health insurance. Increasingly after World War II, an experiment of employers providing health insurance to their employees to make sure they could keep them well and functioning while the war effort ran. And it was very important that the factories go at top-notch speed and with maximum productivity. So employers took over trying to keep their employees healthy. That became a model for most America. Most America was having its healthcare premiums paid entirely by the place of their employment. And health insurance companies don't know from psychologists. They don't reimburse nurses. They don't reimburse anybody except somebody with an MD degree. So all those policies for healthcare would exclude us. One of my warrior colleagues, Rogers Wright, who was a child psychologist in Long Beach, he had found a way around this. And we didn't understand insurance fraud very well back then, but he would do the following. He was working in a practice with a pediatrician who was a personal friend of his. And as a matter of fact, both of them had gone to university on parallel tracks at the same time and knew each other at Northwestern University. One was in medical school and the other was getting a PhD in psychology. So they actually founded the practice together, and all the kids who had emotional or behavioral problems would be referred by the pediatrician to Raj to work with the kid in the family. Raj would do so, and an insurance claim form would be signed for the particular client or family that was being seen. And Roger's name would not appear anywhere. The pediatrician would sign the insurance claim form, so the money would come in and the money would be given to Raj. Things got dicey and complicated about 8 months into this arrangement they had with each other. The pediatrician was on vacation and he was going to be gone on a month off. He was going to Europe, and Raj was left alone in the office and was continuing to see clients and filing insurance claim forms. The pediatrician had left a big stack of pre-signed insurance claim forms so that Raj could continue to do that in his absence, and he did do it. And one of the parents came in and said, could you send an extra form in this month? I'll come for an extra visit. Things are tight and we really need the money. We need the reimbursement money that we'll get if you file the claim. So he had run out of pre-written, pre-signed form. So he signed Rogers Wright, PhD, licensed psychologist, California license number, and put his California license number. The claim form, of course, was rejected, and the insured was told, we do not reimburse for the services of psychologists. So Rogers got in touch with the central office of the insurance company, and he started to get angry with them. He said, I am licensed to provide these services in the state of California. How dare you not reimburse me when I'm doing something that's a legal activity for these people that should be covered by their insurance? How dare you withhold insurance from me? And then they would explain, this is a private contract. Your client was given a list of all the terms and conditions, what we cover, what we don't cover, who we cover and who we don't cover. And in filling out the application, your client agreed to be bound by the terms that are listed there. And nowhere did we give permission or your client accept the possibility of being reimbursed by you. And that felt terrible. We tried as hard as we could after that to try and open up the insurance company's willingness to add psychologists to the list of providers of various kinds that they would reimburse services for under the terms of the health insurance. We got nowhere. We asked the American Psychological Association because it issued health insurance for people who were in employment settings that didn't provide it. If they wanted it, APA had a group insurance plan. The very group insurance plan of the American Psychological Association did not reimburse for the services of psychologists, their own members. So we tried to get them to use their bargaining leverage with one insurance company to set the stage and get at least one insurance company agree to do that. And the damn board of directors of the American Psychological Association would not agree to engage in such a matter, and even said to us, we're not going to do anything to put one more dollar in the pockets of private practitioners. You guys are only interested in money and you don't care about the beauty of our profession. You just want to make money, and we're not going to help you do that. All right. That cultural split is another fault line in our profession. It's going to lead to its collapse. There's little respect or collaboration or agreement between the research academic psychologists in the field and the people who are in practice. Each thinks the other is fucked in many ways and toxic in many ways. And we would be happy if the two groups separated, I believe. And we went back to the 1930s where there was the American Psychological Association and the American Association of Applied Psychology. But that's obviously not going to happen. It is a fault line in the profession, though. So what the hell are we going to do? The next strategy we hit upon was to do a demographic assessment. We knew from just casual observation that psychiatrists were very drawn to the urban centers. The hospitals were there for those who wanted to be an independent practice. A pricey set of human beings lived there. There was not, and the culture was much more supportive of the activities of psychiatrists in urban areas. If you go out in rural areas, farmers don't have a lot of affection for psychiatrists or willingness ordinarily to go see psychiatrists. So interestingly enough, the rural parts of the country had more psychologists per square mile than psychiatrists. There were psychologists working in the school system. There were psychologists working. Some of them might even have a county mental health director who was a psychologist because they couldn't get a psychiatrist to move out in that boondocks county and take the job. So the state would settle for having a psychologist in that position. And will be that as it may, we developed the slogan that there would be much greater and more adequate representation of health service providers. The psychologists were included along with the psychiatrists in health insurance plans. That made a little bit of effort. We at least got some conversations going with some sort of insurance carriers. But then we hit upon something else because this was a big civil rights era that continued to unfold. What we did was we said, government and the insurance company shouldn't be in this. People should have freedom of choice. There are many professions, we stopped hating the MFTs, who are qualified to do various kinds of counseling, psychological services with the public. Public should have equal access to any of them. The public should be left to decide this issue. And again, we brought up the rural-urban issue. If these doors were opened, the likelihood that people could get access to the care they needed would be greatly increased. So New Jersey, God bless them, the state of New Jersey was the first state to pass what was called freedom of choice legislation. It was very simple. It was one sentence. The piece of legislation said, in all health insurance companies written or implemented in the state of California, the word physician shall be understood as including licensed physicians, licensed psychologists, licensed social workers, and licensed marriage and family therapists. So we simply changed the definition of what a physician was in the insurance codes of that state. And that was it. That opened the door. So that movement spread everywhere. And my colleagues were overjoyed. Now they didn't have to worry as insurance increasingly came to be paid for by insurance dollars. They didn't have to worry about how they were going to continue to make their living, because if somebody had insurance, so they only had to pay $20 out of pocket for each session, why would they give the psychologist 75, 100, $150 for the very same service? We felt we would become extinct very quickly if we didn't get on the insurance train. So we did. And I want to say again, as I have previously, that was a conceptual error. It is going to result in our destruction. At that time, it was not very onerous to be on an insurance panel, and there was not very much review of what the services were that were actually being provided by the insurance company. I will fast forward a little and anticipate. I'm going to talk about what the insurance landscape is like now, because it's very different from back then. We became lazy. We became dependent on insurance reimbursement as the way we would make our way forward. We taught that to our students, and we taught them if they were going to go into independent practice, one of the first things they had to do was to get on as many insurance panels as they wanted to in order to keep their practices blossoming and growing. So we became, it was like taking a drug. We became very dependent on a narcotic. The insurance carriers, though, were not stupid. This was our first brush with how well they wanted to start controlling their exposure and their risk. They came back at us soon after they had to authorize us by saying, you have handed us a dilemma, and it's your dilemma too. You have an ethical code. Your ethical code says that people and who call themselves psychologists and offer their services for a fee should not engage in the offer of services for which they don't have appropriate training and experience. And they reminded us, you guys who are psychologists do many things for a fee. Some of you do market research, some of you do motivational speaking, some of you do motivational work in industry. You have a variety of different ways you use psychology and charge the public a fee for the services you render. And yes, they understand the law. They come and get licensed too. They have a license that has questions in it on general psychological matters and not just mental health matters. So we have a special exam for them too, but it's a generic license. Any psychologist who passes either of those exams can get a license. So why should we give money to people who may be filing insurance claim forms, but they have no training or experience in what they're doing? We don't want to give money to them. You need to come up with some way we can identify the people we should be giving, quote, mental health money to, because this is health insurance, and which ones we can turn down if they turn in an insurance claim form. So we jumped through that hoop. We founded what was called the National Register of Health Service Providers in Psychology. We moved beyond our own old definition as clinical psychologists, and we became health service providers. That was the new label we adopted for ourselves. We tied ourselves very closely to the health service industry. We said we're an integral part of the health service industry. And the requirements to get listed in the National Register was, one had to have a doctorate in clinical psychology from an American Psychological Association accredited program, a postdoc from the same thing, and at least 1 year of the internship or postdoc experiences needed to be in a multidisciplinary setting, some staff members of which were physicians. And that took care of about 2/3 of the people, of the psychologists who were licensed in practice. Somewhere along the way in our training, we had been in a setting where docs were present. Oh, if they were consultants, that was we had to learn something about how docs and psychiatrists think about that in order to be a service provider. And my colleagues signed up in droves, and I did too. And at that time, I was stupid enough to be very happy that we found a way to solve the problem. And we started encouraging our graduate students, as soon as they finished their postdoc training and got licensed, they should sign up with the National Register. So the National Register grew into the tens of thousands of people. And in many places, our imprimatur was adopted by health insurance companies. One could not get reimbursed from that particular insurance carrier unless one had that credential too, in addition to others. That narrowing down of perspective has continued unabated. At the present point, my colleagues have, starting in the 1980s, have wanted and have sought getting hospital privileges. Another sign of, and it's being fought, it gets fought all over the place by physicians. They want only physicians to have hospital privileges. But we bring up for legislators the concept of continuity of care. Right now, if you have a client who needs hospitalization and is temporarily incapable of keeping life going outside of a more confined setting, the psychologist typically loses all control. The setting has somebody on staff who takes over the care of the person. The psychologist has no staff privileges in that place. And then ordinarily, the psychologist loses the client permanently and the client moves on. So we wanted to preserve, quote, continuity of care through getting healthcare privileges. I consider this, again, a horrible conceptual mistake that took us further. The metaphor I used, we were moving steadily up out of steerage on the Titanic to higher and higher decks. The next movement, of course, is there are now, I think, somewhere in excess of $10,000 psychologists who have prescribing privileges. They are allowed by their state laws to prescribe psychoactive medications. They have the prescription pad in their office. We have created a curriculum. I helped write it, as a matter of fact. I was still on this train for a long time. I helped conceptualize what the curriculum should be, how much practicum should go with it, how many cases that the psychologist needs to prescribe for under supervision by somebody else with a license allowing prescribing to go on until they could be turned loose on their own. What was the limits? What kind of things should they never be allowed to prescribe? What should be in the armamentarium of chemicals that are relevant to them, that are on the list of things that psychologists can prescribe? All that has been worked out. And in several states now, laws have been passed allowing psychologists to join the ranks. Conceptually, in other ways, I don't mind. Nurse practitioners in many states can prescribe things. Certainly, any GP can prescribe anything. Psychiatrists have no hold on psychoactive medications. They're sharing the privileges with many medical colleagues who've had no training in this topic. In the state of Georgia, pharmacists can now over-the-counter prescribe antidepressant medication of various kinds after interviewing the client. So the spread of being able to prescribe psychiatric medication is increasing everywhere, because here we go about money. The pharmaceutical companies certainly have a vested interest in as many people should be able to pull out a prescription or write a prescription for their goods as possible. And consumers should stay on those goods for as long over a lifetime if necessary, because that makes the maximum profits for the insurance company. Well, something happened in the 1980s that made me rethink everything that I've been involved in and where we have gone. Because another culminating belief now, the chief psychologist in the American Psychological Association believed the following proposition: the future of psychologists and independent practice is probably limited and is going to be increasingly hard to do and to establish. They're in agreement with me. They have the same pessimistic predictions I do. The solution is that psychologists should become medical psychologists, and their natural place of working should become hospitals and medical practices. Every hospital should have several psychologists, and every medical practice, doesn't matter what the practice is, whether it's internal medicine or surgery, whatever, should have several psychologists on the staff, because there's significant important thing that psychologists can do in all those settings. And that's what the future of the profession is to be. Forget about independent practice. And that enrages me. No, I've forgotten where I was going. Oh, yes, the 1980s. Things shifted. Up until then, anybody who the insurance companies would recognize as being eligible for reimbursement could fill out a claim form. They could send it to the insurance company, and if the person was licensed and credentialed in the way the insurance company needed, the insurance company would look at the bill, and if it was within certain parameters that they called usual and customary for the geographical area, if it didn't look too pricey or too chintzy, they would just automatically pay it. There would be no investigation about whether this was worthwhile or needed or anything like that. They had a very small staff of people reviewing claim forms. They were mainly just reviewing them to see if they were in conformity with the laws and the regulations of the insurance carrier. Something happened and went awry, however. In the era of Ronald Reagan, inflation was up at around 12%. And what was sickening, since the employers were also providing health insurance in droves back then, the inflation rate for healthcare was up at 24% a year. For some reason, healthcare was exploding, and the cost of healthcare were going up even more rapidly than were the general costs in the culture. Fortunately, some of that came down, but the imbalance is still there. The healthcare increase each year, and the inflation rate for healthcare is always larger than the general inflation rate. Now, don't ask me if there are rascals running the healthcare industry or not, but it is full of gaming the system. It's full of gaming by the healthcare companies, by the providers, by the administrators. Everybody is trying to game the system and trying to get the maximum bucks out of the system for them that they can, and it's driving. And give as little service as possible, because you save money on keeping your premiums if you give little service. So the healthcare system is a nightmare, and I will protest on behalf of my colleagues. We have been idiots to keep defining ourselves as members of the healthcare system, and to getting ourselves into all of that turbulence, all of that, the disgusting capitalistic petulance and competitiveness and gaming of the system. And that's not where we belong. That's not who we are. That's not what we're all about. Nevertheless, that's what we've been headed, and the insurance companies on our part of the landscape have become increasingly petty. Uh, they invented what was called managed care for the general healthcare marketplace. That means that they started raising the flag of the reason why there's such exorbitant inflation in healthcare delivery is because care is being wasted. The docs are ordering tests that are not necessary. They're performing procedures that are not necessary. There's a lot of terrible waste in the system, and we need to catch the miscreants and close them down and stop the waste in the system. So the healthcare corporations tripled, quadrupled the size of their claims adjusters, and they had them look at very many variables. And they often, there's a clause now in every health insurance contract that the insurer will give, within the parameters, describe what kinds of conditions are in and what may be out. But within those parameters, the insurance carrier will deliver and pay for all needed services, medically necessary services. Now, who gets to decide what's medically necessary? Is it the physician? Is it the patient? No, the insurance company gets to decide what's medically necessary, and almost any insurance claim can be rejected because you've done something to the client and that was fine, but you've also done these two other things and these weren't medically necessary. The first one should have been sufficient. So now many claims have to be contested. There's an appeals process. It's onerous, it's unpleasant, it's ugly. And they are particularly fond of doing that to quote mental health providers, close quote, because we're easy to do that to. You've now given 12, or they even started this at the beginning. We know the federal law is that we have to give 20 sessions of counseling if the client needs 20 sessions of counseling. So we'll authorize 6. You can start with 6, and then we'll see if any more are medically necessary. And they usually find a way to stop after whatever the initial bunch has been. One of my favorite stories is my client on the East Coast, not a client, my colleague on the East Coast, who had a client who he had permission to do 3 visits with. And he had to come back with a treatment plan and an estimate of how many more visits beyond 3 there were to be, if there was to be an extension, and that would be evaluated for worthwhileness. And while he was preparing his case, the client came in a panic. She had had a bad nightmare the night before. And in the nightmare, she was a child being molested. And then some memories came back to her vaguely that the dream may not be a dream. This may have happened to her. And she was really upset. And she said, I may need a lot of care. And he said, well, we'll see what we can do. And he got in touch with the insurance company. And he said, I just found out that by way of asking for more sessions, I think I need at least 20 more before I can be of real help to her, that she may have been molested and is beginning to recover the memories. And he was told by the claims examiner, we're not improving any more than these 3 that we approved. We don't believe the others are medically necessary. You could help her to seal over again and discharge her. And she's gotten by all these years without opening that can of worms. We're not in favor of your opening that can of worms. Wonderful. Another example of the wonderful way the system works. So, as I said, I think we made a major error in judgment in defining ourselves as healthcare providers. We never should have done that. We had an older identity that goes back to the beginning and early first few decades in the 20th century. We should have remained applied psychologists. As I have been fond of saying to graduate students, look, the people I see are clients. They are not patients. I'll get into that thing too in a moment. I don't know why we cannot educate people to pay for what we're giving them. Law, architecture, accounting, space planning, kitchen design, all kinds of service professions go forward. They don't have any insurance that reimburses for those things. They simply do whatever they've been trained to do, and the customers pay a fee for whatever are the services. I like that model much better for us. And I think it puts us in a better circumstance. If we are part of the healthcare system, we get into medical arrogance. We are the ones who know. We give a diagnosis. We know what's wrong. We know what the client should do. We're in the power position, and they should just come and sit at our knees, tell us a little about themselves, and then implement whatever we're telling them to do. It stops what's most precious about what we do. It stops being a collaborative effort between two people. As Martin Buber, the existentialist, said, that there are many relationships, the healing relationship with another human being being one of those, where the relationship must be an I-thou relationship, where there's something holy about it, something loving about it, something intimate about it. If we go over from into the being members of the healthcare system, we're in an I-it relationship. The client is an it, the client is a specimen that we're supposed to analyze and make conclusions about, come up with ways of shoring up the client or changing the client. We are the expert and they're in the deferent position. And that is a very bad position to be in with our clients. Come to us because we have specialized wisdom and we'll do something to you and we'll go hocus pocus and you'll be better then. And it's up to us to make something happen to you because of our greater power and greater expertise. I think I'm coming close to the end. Yeah, as I said, oh, no, there's another principle about how the payers who pay us work. The payers who pay us would like to pay us as little as possible because that leaves more money in the entire entity to do other things with, like reward stockholders with the bonuses or pay higher salaries to the executives. So there will be a push downward. I would be happy to support this, by the way. Marriage and family therapists are still not written into the Medicaid regulations. And when we succeeded in getting into Medicare and Medicaid, the social workers came along with us. So it's now physicians, psychologists, and social workers. The marriage and family therapists want in. I'm fine. I'd be glad to sign any petition that lets them in. I don't want to kick them out. But in California, of course, the insurance companies recognize marriage and family therapists. But now we are creating various kinds of counselors. And those counselors are usually trained at the master's degree. And our Board of Psychology is now going to recognize psychological counselors as yet another entity that they're going to be responsible for regulating. So I think the number of licensed psychologists that insurance companies are willing to reimburse is going to start going south and decaying as rapidly as possible. And counselors will do a lot of the work. And then we're going to go down to, there are now specialized counselors that are already doing this work. There are substance abuse counselors who are employed in various settings. Hospitals employ them, other people employ them. Their main credential is that they've graduated college, some of them only high school, and they are reformed addict themselves. And that's the credential, but they get hired as a professional person. They get paid about $35,000 to $40,000 a year. And so I think the average salaries of all of us who are in the healing professions, who like having interesting conversations that might be inspiriting with clients, that's going to be delegated downwards in the systems of public pay or entrepreneurial pay, that's going to be all delegated downward to people with less and less education and less skill, and we're going to be left high and dry. Our only hope is to reimagine ourselves as applied psychologists and to learn how to make connections with people and to do what I do, to try and be Robin Hood and get enough very wealthy people who will give us really nice, sustaining reimbursement for the services we give them, so we can do a lot of pro bono work and take care of the needs of the poor, charging them nothing or charging them very little. It is possible to do that. And my final comments about the escape is the profession may disappear entirely. It will cease being a licensed profession. There won't be enough of us to bother with. The Board of Psychology will continue to give certificates of one sort or another to people who don't carry the title psychologist, but are criminal counselors. I don't know. We will find specialized counselors for various places that there are troublesome people in the culture, and we'll turn the counselors loose on them with much less education and experience, and with a very narrow view of what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to help the person adapt to whatever was the name of the pain that they were carrying at the time. If that wave happens, I think the life coach movement will flourish. The life coach movement is about 50 years behind where psychology was when we started out. Life coaching is now very vibrant. There are thousands of life coaches in the United States, and some of them are generalized. They are just there to be a life coach, and any human dilemma, whether it be a dilemma in the workplace, a marriage dilemma, a dilemma of interpersonal strain of some kind, a parenting dilemma, they will be there to keep the person company and to try and pass on whatever wisdom they can muster. Some of them are very specialized. The high-end life coaches work with senior executives in Fortune 500 companies, and their shtick is to make those people as effective and as deadly as they possibly can make them. They teach them habits of success. Boy, do they get a lot of money. Some of them are motivational speakers, the life coaches. So it's not a homogenous profession, and it's totally unregulated at this moment. There is an international association of life coaches, but this is totally voluntary. It has no legal standing anywhere. There's no requirement that one join that organization in order to declare oneself a life coach. So both things, the fermentation and creativity of being set free from any restraints and being regulated in any way is wonderful. It leads to great creativity and to innovation. On the other hand, it leads to a whole bunch of idiots and bad practices blossoming at the same time. So it's not a wonderful thing. We were not a terrific profession when we were unlicensed. We had really crazy people in this profession, and licensing did help to sort out some people who were actually destructive and to keep them from hanging out of shingle and charging fees. So I have that sour and sad take on the future of my profession. Maybe a small number of us will continue to exist for a while. I ain't going to be here to see what goes on, so I'm sad about that. And I do believe the following. Every culture needs spiritual leaders, tribal elders, people who possess some kind of good sense about the dilemmas of life and what to do about them. People that those who are lost can go and have conversations with and come away feeling nourished and sustained. So the anthropological function of tribal elder in our culture is not going to go away. I don't know whether there's any formal group that's going to fill it or what kinds of people will enter that vacuum, what the jockeying is going to be, but I know that that's going to continue because it It's much needed by any group of any collective of human souls. I also believe that the profession of psychiatry is doomed, and I think psychiatry is going to disappear even faster than psychology does, because poor psychiatry, they used to talk to people, but they get only 6 weeks of training on how to talk to anybody now, and all the rest of it is on how to make diagnoses of neuronal or other kind of malfunctioning and what the correct medicine is to dispense. And they don't control that market. All their medical colleagues and then some others like nurse practitioners and pharmacists are able to do the very same thing and will do it cheaper and more easily and maybe even with less discrimination. So the pharmaceutical companies will be happy. More people will get hooked for a lifetime on the stuff that the pharmaceutical companies are manufacturing. And I think they deserve to die. They deserve to die because they turned their back on conversations. And they deserve to die because psychoanalysis was once the leading edge of psychiatry, the talking cure and trying to understand people and to understand the culture and the interactions that people were engaged in was an important part of the training of psychiatrists. We are now into a very egocentric psychiatry. Whatever are the problems are in the biology of the person they're talking to. They have little concept of the trouble being stirred by the interpersonal surround in which the person is embedded, or by things that are happening in the culture, or anything outside the neuronal system of the client himself or herself. And that's such a narrow view. It misses so much that we need to take into account if we're to be helpful to people who want us to help them to live more effectively. It isn't only about what our neurons are doing or not doing. That will never lead to a really good rearrangement of a lifestyle. It will lead to being able to tolerate a bad lifestyle often, because the pain is muted by the chemical that's being given. And the bad life continues unabated. All right, I will stop at that point, and I think I'm finished with this topic unless other things occur to me.
I wanted to make a couple kind of like observations and comments, Arthur. I see and experience and am part of kind of like the great value of kind of the private practice, and hope it goes on certainly kind of like throughout my lifetime and then beyond. But I do want to make a point in terms of that it shouldn't sort of preclude the utilization of psychologists in a whole lot of medical settings, and the usefulness of psychologists in medical settings.
I'm a big fan of what we call health psychology.
Yes.
It is about learning and inventing new tasks that psychologists can do in the house of medicine. It isn't about becoming junior psychiatrists.
Right.
My favorite one is, I know this guy from APA. He lives, he's a professor of health psychology at the local university. And he started asking physicians in the ER, what is one of the biggest causes of costs to the ER? And what they mentioned to him was teenage kids who show up, diabetic teenage kids who show up who haven't been monitoring their glucose levels, and then go into a terrible tailspin and have to be rushed to the ER or not die. So my colleague said, Jesus, what could I do to get that number down? And cell phones were just being invented then. So, and kids were, of course, going crazy, getting on their cell phones and learning to start text messaging with each other. So he developed a computer program that would simply text them at 7:30 in the morning, it's time for you to measure your glucose level. And if it's out of whack, you have to add some extra insulin today. And that very thing, just being nagged that way by their telephone, cut the such a admissions in the Houston hospital percent. That's the kind of thing psychologists can do, because I think it's been estimated that 40 to 50% of the costs of healthcare delivery are in people's non-compliance. They come in, they go to the doctor tells them what to do, and they just don't do it. And that ain't a medical problem. If anybody's going to solve that one, psychologists need to get to work on that with a vengeance.
And going back to kind of like the period of managed care, you know, and I was sort of privy to that because
Yeah, you were in the middle of it.
I was in the middle of it, and I was in the thick of it, and it was like I understood it very, very well. But part of the advent of managed care was probably, you know, kind of like the greediness of psychiatrists, and that psychiatrists were keeping people in the hospital and charging exorbitant rates,
Yep,
you know, for their
no doubt
services.
about it.
And it was just kind of like out of control. So either the corporations and or the insurance companies said, you know, listen, this has to stop. We've got to be able to kind of really sort of monitor this and address this, and to decrease these exorbitant costs that are really just, you know, to the roof. And that's what they did. I, you know, was privy to, even though I did outpatient utilization management and quality assurance, I was privy to the war room, where they were looking at, you know, various inpatient processes, and really kind of like just really monitoring that and addressing it, you know, every single day, in terms of kind of like, well, you know, how was this patient doing, and what you know, what were they being prescribed, and what was the psychiatrist doing. So they really, you know, tried to kind of lower the costs and the expense of sort of a more egregious, you know, greediness.
Yeah, Aaron knows this one well. The elder care settings are very ripe to be exploited.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of that, a lot of unnecessary, or people be. I remember once at a hospital, I think there was a lot of people were getting orthopedic shoes. I'm not sure I ever saw those people walk.
Yeah, lots of people were getting psychotherapy sessions and they were unconscious.
Yeah, there was all that kind of that. I'm sure that went on. I never personally participated in anything like that. I did do quite a bit of free sessions with people who didn't qualify, but I
That's
saw them
fine.
anyway.
Free
You know, just
sessions are wonderful.
yeah.
Mm.
I
Oh,
remember I would track the people I saw that no one would get paid for, and the billing department would get back to me like, you realize we can't bill for this. And I said, yeah, I understand. I'm just seeing them, I'm talking to them.
by the way, I even participated in an attempt to solve the excess utilization and plundering the pot issue. There was a mid position. First, the insurance companies didn't want to have to add on huge more staffs and do a lot of research and investigation of a lot of claims. So they did something that would have been wonderful if it had stuck. They came to the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, and they said, we want you to develop and then tell us about, so we can comment on, a peer review system. So if we have a concern about one of your insurance claims, there will be a jury of peers for this person that we can send the claim we're concerned about to, and they will have the final word about whether they think the claim is justified or not. And I think that would be wonderful, because the peers who I guess they would get paid. They would get paid for like sitting in a jury. You get a fee for being a juror for a period.
Yeah.
And all of us should be subject to having to do this. If we get called to review a claim, we would show up with
Mhm.
3 or 4 other colleagues who would listen to this and then try and make a determination. I think it would be a
Yeah.
wonderful system, and we have no dog in the horse show there. I mean, the insurance companies have a pony in the show. They want to cut the costs as much as they can, but we have no vested interest in cutting costs. I would hope if it wasn't our cases, we would show up and say, is this reasonable for a client? Is this good care for this particular client? That's all we would be concerned about.
Hmm.
But that didn't work either. The insurance companies decided they could do a better job with a heavy hatchet.
Hmm.
Ah. There is an essential problem in all of this. The problem is I'm not Lord of the universe. That's what the problem is.
Not yet. Not yet.
Should I keep working on
Should we take a vote?
it? Oh, God. Oh, here's my last insanity. You know me. When there's a world problem, I'm often, since a lot of what we do is problem solving, I'm always trying to find a solution to a terrible world problem. I have the solution to the atomic threats from Putin. There's a simple, elegant solution I think would work very well. All it takes is for the Chinese president to get in touch with Putin and say, the Chinese people are not going to tolerate any use of nuclear weapons. If you unleash any kind of nuclear weapon, we are going to destroy Moscow. And that's it. That's all he has to do. And I don't think Putin would unleash a nuclear weapon. And the West is off the hook. We're not telling him anything. We're not interfering with whatever he's doing. We're not responding to his threats. The Chinese would get a tremendous gain out of that. They suddenly become the way people who have found the way to peace. They would rise up on the rank of world leadership, having done something very creative and very effective. Everybody wins if that were to be implemented, except Putin.
Or Moscow.
Are you going to send that
If
in
that
to,
were made public, the residents of Moscow would assassinate Putin pretty quickly.
are you going to send that into the New York Times?
Nah. But it was fun having that daydream with Putin. All right, guys, I'll see you next week.
Okay, have a good
right.
weekend.
Bye-bye, guys.
See you.